Every time I read that text, I can't help but thinking, well, that's embarrassing. Can you imagine? You've shown up to the wedding celebration and you just presumed that you were to be honored there. Your presence there was so important that you would just automatically receive one of the better seats in one of the chief rooms of the house. You just make your way to the best seat that you can find in there, and the one who invited you to come comes and finds you and basically removes you from that place. And you have to parade by all of those other folks as he leads you down back to the lowest seat where he intended for you to be. And you think about the reverse of that and how kind of a smile on your face it would bring if you had just come in and taken the lowest seat that was available to you when you arrived, and the one who had invited you to come comes and takes you by the hand and says, "Oh, no, 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 I have a place of honor and prestige for you. Come up to the chief seat up here in the upper room. Let me show others how I'm exalting you." You see, the Lord wants us to appreciate and understand that humility is vital in our walk in this life. It's something that all of us have to work at and strive to produce as a character trait that we have in our lives. And it can be embarrassing when our humility gets the worst of us or the lack thereof, and we find ourselves placing ourselves in situations that create a moment where we're embarrassed because we have to be humbled rather than being humble. It's an interesting scenario when you think about it, and there's really just three things that I want you to notice about what Jesus does with these folks here in Luke chapter 14. And number one, I want you to notice that it was an observable action. You know, it's a parable that he gives to them there in Luke chapter 14, but the truth is, he's using a parable of what he actually had already witnessed in their actions. Go back into Luke chapter 14 for a moment with me here, and let's look at this particular account. And I want you to notice in the very beginning of this narrative that Jesus notes he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places. And then he begins to speak to them. You see, Jesus sitting there observed those who had been coming into the wedding feast, and he noticed something interesting as he's in the house of this Pharisee, I should say. The parable's about a wedding feast. He's in the home of a Pharisee here in Luke chapter 14. And Jesus notices as each one came in, they were looking for the best place in the house in which to sit. And Jesus makes that observation. And my point is simply this. Sometimes our lack of humility or our presumptive actions are more observable and noticeable than we think. Notice verse 10. He said in his example or teachings unto them, he says, when you're invited, go and sit down in the lowest place you can find. Don't exalt yourself. Show some humility and come into that situation and show how it is that you can sit at the lower seat and be just as accepting of that. And so that when that person who had invited you to come may say, friend, go up higher, then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself, you know, it's an embarrassing trait, right? It's something we have to be cautious of. Applauding ourselves is not a good character trait. Exalting ourselves, patting ourselves on the back, whatever you want to call it, it is not something something God would want to observe in us. Jesus said, I noticed that you immediately exalted yourself rather than letting somebody else exalt you. For whoever exalts himself will be humble. Notice Jesus says. And he who humbles himself will be exalted. You know what I appreciate about that principle? Simply this. We're going to be one or the other at some point in time. Either we learn humility as a character trait, we adopt it as who we are as a person, and we act accordingly. Or we're going to find ourselves in a situation or a circumstance where the situation humbles us. Or someone in that situation humbles us because we were presumptive. And we need to recognize that sometimes we may not think we're being that way, or sometimes we may not recognize that others are observing that character trait in each of us. In fact, the opposite should be true. Just as Jesus noticed of them that they like to exalt themselves, just as Jesus noticed that they were not very humble within themselves and had to be humbled in some senses, he also says that we can observe the good quality of somebody who is humble. Well, how do we notice the difference? Well, verse 35 of Mark chapter 9, notice with me. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, then he has to outrun the rest of you. That's the way we think, right? What we think of being first is you have to outrun. And I guess if you're talking about a foot race of some type or kind, then maybe your argument is true. But Jesus isn't talking about a foot race here. He's talking about character. And He's talking about our ability to demonstrate the kind of character that He would want from us. So if anyone desires to be first, back up one verse, by the way, they're arguing and disputing who's the greatest. And Jesus says, if anyone wants to be great in the kingdom, if anybody wants to be first in the kingdom, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Humility is not something that we claim. Humility is not something that feels very good when it has to be shown to us. Humility is something that we demonstrate by not just claiming it, by exemplifying. I'm okay with being last. I'm okay with being servant of all. I desire others to be exalted. I desire that others are promoted above, and I'm okay with being servant to others. Because we need to remember that humility in service is just as important as the service itself. And what I simply mean by that, if you have to get credit for it, you and I aren't being humble. If we have to get acknowledged for it. Now, it's proper for somebody else to acknowledge. That's kind of what's happening in Luke 14, right? What's happening in Luke 14 is somebody chose on their own to not show any humility, and they walked to the chief seat in the house, and they chose it for themselves because they exalted themselves. Jesus says the opposite is better. Humble yourself, sit in the lowest seat, and let the one who bids you come exalt you. We'll see that before we're done today. But when we're serving and we're honoring others and we're being the servant of all, then we need to also recognize that we've got to be cautious that we're not trying to parade ourselves for the purpose of being seen. Verse 10 of Luke 17, so likewise you, when you have done all those things which you are commanded, say we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. Jesus says when you serve, just serve. You're just honoring what God has called you to be. When you're being a servant unto others, you're just being what God called you to be. Just serve. Because at the end of the day, no matter how great our service might be, no matter how many exaltations it receives, no matter how grand or how wonderful others observe it to be, no matter how many accolades are laid upon it, at the end of the day, we're all just unprofitable servants doing the best that we can to honor and serve our God every day. And what we are able to muster in our lives, what we're able to create, the service that we're able to render will pale in comparison to anything that God has done for us. It will pale in comparison to what Jesus has accomplished. So just be humble and serve. Don't worry about recognition. Don't worry about Ed Parsons showing up with the Wetzel Chronicle. Just serve. Just serve. Let that humility show forth in all that we do. Because ultimately, God rewards the humble. God rewards those who are willing to humble themselves, not just before men, but before Him as well. James chapter 4 and in verse 10. Where Jesus, or rather James, simply says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. Allow God to be the one doing the exalting. Let God be the one lifting up. Don't lift yourself up. Don't look for the reward. Don't feel like you've got to always pat yourself. Don't do any of those things. Just serve. Serve with humility and let the Lord lift. Let the Lord lift you up. Our humility or lack of is a noticeable, observable character trait, Jesus says. Because He saw it in them in Luke chapter 14. Number 2. Jesus noticed the choice that they made. You know what I appreciate about that? Well, there's lots of things, I suppose, but one thing I want you to note this morning is simply this, that God and Jesus don't just know what we think about them. They don't just know what our thought processes are or what our basic internal belief structure might be, but they observe the way we conduct ourselves. As followers and believers of Jesus Christ, God's watching. He's not just looking into the heart of man, He's also observing the way that we conduct ourselves. And Jesus was sitting there watching and observed how they were conducting themselves. And the truth is, we can show a lack of humility in a lot of different ways if we're not careful. In fact, we can evidence that our partiality. You know what's interesting, and it's not necessarily phrased there in Luke chapter 14, but I think it's observed, and that is simply this. If I exalted myself and went and sat in the chief seat, that means that in my mind I'm better than what? Everybody else. I'm better than everybody else sitting down here in these lower seats. I'm better than you, and as you passed by them all, because the implication of what Jesus is describing is that you had to walk past them all in order to get to that chief seat. Because the same is true when the person of the house comes and leads you there. But every person that I walked by, presumably so, every person that I walked by, I was making a grand statement that I'm better than you. You know, we have to be very careful sometimes that we don't show partiality in ways that we don't even realize we are. James chapter 2 and in verse 3. And you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes. Do we do that? Oh, no, preacher, I don't do that. Let me ask you something. A guy walks in here as a visitor, never seen him before, and he's in a three-piece suit. Do you react one way? But if he came in, tattered jeans and a torn-up shirt, what would you do? What would you do? Would the guy in a three-piece suit come in, sit down, probably unnoticeable in some ways? You wouldn't concern yourself whatsoever about that fella. You just assume he's a good church-going guy because he's wearing a suit, right? They all wear suits. But a guy comes in and he doesn't look the part, and all of a sudden I'm anxious about him. That's what's going on. And not so much just concerned about physical things in relationship to that, but notice he said they were distinguishing the rich from the poor. That's what's happening in James chapter 2. The rich folk had the nice clothes, they had the nice seats, and you, poor fella, go sit at my feet. There's a nice comfy floor there for you. Sometimes partiality can be shown just in the choices that we're making and the manner in which we treat people in various circumstances. You pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, sit here in a good place. You say to the poor man, you stand over there. Standing room only for you, fella. All right, you need a seat. Sit over there. Sit over there at my footstool. Well, that's a great place to sit, isn't it? What's a footstool? It's a place for my feet. You sit where I normally put my feet. You go sit there. And you say, well, I would never do that. But what I'm suggesting to you sometimes is we do it, and we do it in ways that we don't necessarily recognize all the time. Let me illustrate. So lots of charitable things happen this time of year, right? And so you decide that you're gonna go grab some things at the grocery store and you're gonna contribute to some place that's collecting food. Now, at my own table at home, I serve nothing but Jolly Green Giant, right? Nothing but the brand names for me and my table because I can't take that crazy generic stuff. But for the poor, give me 18 boxes of that macaroni and cheese that my kids won't eat. And let me give that to those who need it. I'm just saying. Sometimes our partialities are hidden and we don't even realize that we're being partial. Sometimes we do things and then we rationalize that, right? How do you rationalize that? Well, if I do that, I can give more. Now, maybe you're being honest about that. I'm not trying to judge you. Maybe in your mind you're thinking, I've got $50, whatever it is, and I can spread $50 out more if I buy cheaper things, and I can do more with it. I get that, and if that's your heart, oh, the Boy Scouts are collecting. Let me rummage through the cupboard for those things that I haven't used in 52 years. I'm not judging. I'm really not. I'm trying to be real. To give us food for thought in ways that we sometimes are partial and don't recognize it. Things we would choose for our own families, would I choose that for others as well? Things that I provide daily for my own families, would I offer the same? When I was a kid, Dad's health was still good at the time, yet to be diagnosed, and he was coaching basketball. And he took the basketball team to I think we were down in Matamore somewhere playing grasshopper basketball. We had 2 or 3 kids coming back with us that trip, and Dad decided he's going to stop. I don't even remember where it was, some little Tasty Freeze kind of place. And he told the guys that were with us, he said, my treat, boys, and because he didn't know who brought money, who didn't bring money, who had, he wasn't trying. So he just said, on me, fellas. And they're ordering burgers and fries and milkshakes and everything. And Dad looked at me and says, you'll have a hot dog, a small fry. He wasn't about to let his son order 3 hamburgers, 2 milkshakes, and 6 large order of fries, and you over there, you go eat a hot dog. He taught me a lesson, and you think he didn't teach me a lesson? I'm still talking about it. Here I am, pretty near 40 years later. And I'm still thinking about that on occasion. The lesson and the value of that. Be careful. Sometimes our partiality isn't blatant. Sometimes our partiality isn't look at that race or look at that particular individual or look at their social status or look at that poor. Sometimes it can be in ways that we don't even recognize. But our actions are saying, go sit at my footstool. And it can happen in all those areas if we're not careful. Do we only choose the most comfortable tasks? In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19, Paul said, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win them all. Paul says, I don't owe anybody anything. But I am willing to serve everybody if it would mean that the cause of Christ can be forwarded in the right ways. What do you choose? If we only choose the most comfortable things in life, the most comfortable tasks, the easiest things to accomplish, the easiest things to do. And if we're not careful, we're showing partiality by simply saying to ourselves, I want to do as little as I can to still have a good conscience at the end of the day. And so I'll help somebody in need because it's kind of the right thing to do this time of year. Now in March, don't bother me. Right? We've got to be careful. Do we choose even the most uncomfortable task? Am I willing to do that which may not be easy for me to do? Am I willing to do those things that are sacrificial? Am I willing to serve and honor and choose? Not say partiality. I'm only sitting in the most comfortable chair in the house. The rest of you go sit somewhere else. Or am I willing to choose the most difficult and challenging tasks? In fact, faithful servants of God don't do anything through partiality. They don't look through biased eyesight. They don't use partiality as their thinking process. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 21, he said, I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. Nothing. Your thoughts, your actions, your speech, all of it. Don't do anything with partiality. The way you think, the way you speak, the way you act. Irregardless of the circumstance, irregardless of the reasons why people show prejudices, don't ever. And you say, well, Brian, were they really being prejudiced there in Luke chapter 14? I'm arguing they were. As they paraded themselves by and walked to the chief seat in the house, they were saying, I'm better than you. And that's really in some ways what prejudice is. I'm better than you. And for any host of reasons that I might choose to think that way. So he said, just remove it. Because Jesus says, I'm watching, I'm seeing, I'm observing, I know. Jesus knows when His followers are being partial or not. Number 3. What I love about Jesus then is He turns this situation, and He's watched all this go on for a little while now, and He sees these guys walking on by and taking the chief seats and thumbing their nose at everybody else in the house. He uses that moment as a teaching opportunity. I want you to notice something. Go back into Luke chapter 14 because you get a little better picture of how this whole thing unfolds. If we look at verse 1. The parable comes in verses 7 through 11, but notice what gets us there. So verse 1, Luke 14, back to the narrative. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. Now isn't that interesting? They've invited Jesus there to watch him. He actually turns out to be the one observing them. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Pretty simple question, right? Okay for me to heal this guy on the Sabbath day? But they kept silent, and he took him and healed him and let him go. So they wouldn't answer. They won't answer, so he heals him, lets him go. So then he answers them in verse 5, saying, which of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. You know why? Because they've gone and pulled their donkey and their ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath day. That's why. They've absolutely done that before. Jesus has now made it personal. You made a big deal about me healing this man with the dropsy on the Sabbath day, and all of you know that you've been out there dragging your donkey out of the ditch on the Sabbath day and judging me. And you won't even answer the questions that I brought before you. They could not answer him regarding these things. So then he tells them the parable that we just studied. It's because of that situation. It's because of this attitude and disposition of mind that they had. Of how their understanding of the law was so much better than Jesus' understanding. And yet when Jesus examples before them, He tries to teach and help them understand the truth. Friends, Jesus turns everything, many situations, I should say, into a teaching moment. They don't want to answer His questions. They don't want to participate. But what Jesus is looking for is focused participants. Notice verse 38 of chapter 10. It happened as they went that He entered a certain village. A certain woman named Martha welcomed Him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard His word. Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him, Lord, you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. The Pharisees were not interested in participating in Jesus' little educational experience. They were not interested in hearing the questions that he asked. At least they weren't interested in responding to them. They weren't there to learn from him. The Pharisees were there to observe him, hopefully, in something they could accuse him of. You could see the light bulbs go off in their minds when he heals that man to the dropsy. But before they could even breathe enough breath into their bodies to provide an answer, we've got you, he says, by the way, be okay to go get a donkey or an ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath day? And what do the Pharisees have to do? Exhale. We got nothing. That's what's happening, right? They're not willing participants in the learning process here. Martha, Martha, you're not being a willing participant in the educational process here. Mary's chosen that good part. What Jesus wants from us is when He begins to educate and teach, He wants us to become focused participants in that. He didn't ask a question of the Pharisees just to ask a question. This isn't just academics. Jesus wants them to learn something. He wants them to see their attitude and disposition of partiality. That's why the parable. He wants to see how their false understanding of the law has led them to false conclusions about Him, but they're not willing participants. So here's the question of the morning, friends, simply this. Jesus looks us in the eyes and says, are you being partial? Are you showing prejudices? Do you look at others as better or lower than yourself? Do you walk past others presuming that you have right to certain things that they don't have right to? How are you treating other people? And how are you doing that every day? Because in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, you know the text. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn. Some translations use the word from. Some translations use the word of. May I suggest to you those are slightly different. And maybe both are important. There's one sense that we learn from Jesus. He teaches, He educates, He gives us an example. We learn from it. But we also need to learn of Jesus. A man who showed no partiality, who went to a cross and died for anyone and everyone who wants to come and find remission of sins. Jesus had not a partial bone in His body. Jesus, who was sitting in heaven, not thinking it robbery to be equal with God, lowered Himself and became a servant. A servant to whom, Paul? He became a servant to all, just like Paul was challenging himself to be. Learn of Jesus, not just from Him. I'm asking you and I this morning to not just know what Jesus wants from us, but to live what Jesus wants from us. To live out that diligently, proving the things that He shared with us, observing them, living them. And let that humility lead us to recognize that Jesus is the master teacher in John chapter 3. As Nicodemus came to Him by night and calls Him Rabbi, Jesus says, you understand something here, don't you? You understand the kind of teacher that I am. I'm asking us this morning, are we willing to recognize not just what Jesus said and say, yeah, that's right. We shouldn't be prejudiced. We shouldn't be partial. But move beyond just an educational moment and recognize that Jesus wants you and I to be of Him. Learn of Him. Follow that example. Educate ourselves and imitate. And never think of ourselves as better than anyone else for any reason or cause. No matter what kind of thing that we're trying to frame that under. No matter whatever it is. The truth is, I'm not better than anybody. And if my actions say something different, then I need to work on correcting that. And let others if they so choose to give me credit for things that I accomplish or do. Ultimately, let God lift us up, because that's the greatest exaltation you and I could ever receive. So if you're subject to the gospel in some way, Jesus had no partiality. He wants every single soul that's willing to come to Him to find remission of sins, to be saved. Maybe you've done that, something's amiss, we could pray for you concerning. Will you show forth the love of Jesus today by honoring Him and His commands for the great gift and sacrifice that He's provided without partiality? Will you embrace it to the saving of your soul? And if we could help you do that, won't you come as we stand, as we sing?